Farming isn't about peace and quiet. It's about outlasting dirt that wants you dead. When Clara dug her first mud hole, the valley laughed. When she dug her 100th, they called her crazy. 6 months later, they were stealing her blueprints just to keep their families from going under. Dust doesn't just settle, it gets into the hinges of your life. It coated the windshields of the pickup trucks parked outside Toby's diner, turned the morning coffee bitter, and reminded everyone in the Oakhaven Valley that the sky hadn't spit out a drop of rain since April. Clara Finch sat on the hood of her battered Chevy, watching a drilling rig rumble down the county highway. It was headed for Harlan Briggs' property. That made 3 rigs this month. The water table was dropping fast, retreating deep into the limestone bedrock. The solution, at least according to the old-timers and the corporate ag boys, was simple. You chase it. You pay $30,000, you bore a 600-foot hole into the earth, and you suck up whatever fossil water is left to keep your corn from turning to dry husks. Clara didn't have $30,000. She had her late father's accumulated debt, 60 acres of sloping pasture that was baking into ceramic clay, and a topographical map spread across her kitchen table that she had stared at until her eyes bled. She wasn't going to drill. She was going to dig. The next morning, an excavator rattled up her driveway. It wasn't a pristine piece of equipment. It leaked hydraulic fluid, and the operator, a chain-smoking contractor named Garrett, looked at Clara like she had lost her mind. "You want me to dig what, exactly?" Garrett asked, leaning out of the cab. "Trenches," Clara said, handing him a clipboard with a heavily marked map. "But not continuous. Ponds. Long, shallow depressions, following the contour lines of the hill." Garrett wiped grease off his chin. "Clara, a pond needs water. You ain't got a creek. You ain't got a spring. You're just asking me to tear up good pasture to make a bunch of dry craters." "I know what I'm asking. 2 feet deep, sloped on the downhill side. Start at the top ridge." Garrett shrugged. It was her money. The valley heard the diesel engine before they saw what it was doing. For 2 straight weeks, Garrett tore into the Finch property. It was a violent, ugly process. The bucket scraped against compacted clay and occasional limestone, screaming in protest. Clara walked behind the machine with a laser level, measuring the depth, adjusting the angles, forcing Garrett to recut lines that were off by mere inches. Harlan Briggs drove his truck up to her fence line on the 5th day. Harlan farmed 2,000 acres of irrigated soy and corn. He was a man who believed in brute-forcing nature into submission. If a pest showed up, you poisoned it. If the ground dried out, you pumped water from the deep earth until the pipes rattled. He didn't get out of his truck. He rolled the window down, letting the air conditioning spill out into the 90-degree heat. "Arthur would have a stroke if he saw you butchering his hill," Harlan called out. Clara didn't stop pounding a wooden surveyor's stake into the dirt. "Arthur went bankrupt trying to farm your way, Harlan. I'm just trying something else." Harlan looked at the ragged, jagged scars tearing across the hillside. There were dozens of them now. Staggered, crescent-shaped ditches that looked like the graves of giants. "You're building catchments for rain that doesn't fall, and even if it does, it's just going to evaporate in these shallow pans. You need a deep well, Clara. I can loan you the cash. 6% interest." "I don't want a well," she said, finally standing up and wiping sweat from her forehead. "Deep wells are just life support. I'm trying to fix the lungs." Harlan shook his head, rolled his window up, and drove off. By the end of the week, the joke had spread through town. They called them Finch's Frog Ponds. The diner echoed with laughter over plates of eggs and hash browns. "Did you hear? Clara's building a marina on the dry hill. She's trying to catch moonbeams." She ignored them. She counted her shrinking bank balance, The excavator rental was bleeding her dry, but the map in her head was finally translating to the dirt. 120 ponds. They were swales, really, designed on a keyline water system. The concept wasn't magic, it was basic physics. Water runs downhill. When it runs fast, it takes the topsoil with it and escapes into the river. When you force it to stop, to sit level across the contour of a hill, it does the only thing it can do. It sinks. When Garrett packed up his rig and drove away, Clara was left with a landscape that looked like a war zone. 120 raw, brown scars terracing down the slope. No grass, no water, just dust. The waiting was a physical ache. July burned into August, bringing a relentless, windless heat that sucked the remaining moisture out of everything. The trees on the edge of Clara's property began to drop their leaves early, an act of sheer botanical desperation. The earth cracked. The fissures in the clay were wide enough to swallow a wrench. Clara spent her days walking the dry ponds. The sun had baked the exposed dirt into concrete. She walked with a shovel, manually clearing out rocks that had tumbled into the trenches, smoothing the downhill berms, seeding them with a cover crop of clover and deep-rooted rye that currently had absolutely no chance of germinating. Her hands were a map of burst blisters and yellow calluses. Her clothes smelled permanently of dry earth and old sweat. Financially, she was hanging by a thread. She ate oatmeal for dinner. She ignored the letters from the county tax assessor. Across the road, Harlan's farm was a vivid, unnatural green. His massive center pivot irrigators crawled in slow circles, spraying thousands of gallons of water into the dry air. From her porch, Clara could hear the deep, rhythmic thumping of his massive diesel water pumps running 24 hours a day. It sounded like a heartbeat, but it was a mechanical one, artificial and strained. Then, in mid-August, the heartbeat skipped. Clara was fixing a fence post when she heard the sudden, high-pitched whine from Harlan's pump station. It was the sound a machine makes when it's starved. The engine revved violently, choked, and abruptly shut down into a heavy silence. Later that afternoon at the hardware store, she heard the truth from Toby. "Harlan's pumping sand," Toby said, leaning over the counter. "His main well dropped another 20 feet this week. The pump sucked up the bottom of the aquifer, destroyed the impellers. He's got to bring a rig back out to lower the pipes. Cost him a fortune." Clara bought her nails and left. She didn't feel vindicated, she just felt tired. The water table was collapsing beneath all of them. Harlan's wealth could buy him another 100 feet of pipe, but eventually you hit bedrock. 2 nights later, the air pressure shifted. It wasn't a gentle change. The sky turned the color of bruised iron. A cold wind ripped down the valley, carrying the distinct metallic smell of ozone and wet dust. It wasn't a saving rain. It was a violent, angry storm. In Oak Haven, late summer storms are notorious. They drop 2 inches of rain in 45 minutes. On baked, concrete-hard soil, that water doesn't soak in. It acts like it's hitting glass. It flashes into a sheet, rips across the surface, tears away the precious topsoil, and causes flash floods in the creek beds before disappearing downstream. The first drops hit Clara's tin roof like buckshot. She didn't stay inside. She grabbed a heavy raincoat and ran out into the dark. The rain was blinding, coming down in sheets, illuminated by jagged flashes of lightning. The ground was instantly slick. Clara scrambled up the muddy hillside toward the highest ridge. Her boots slipped, and she fell to her knees, coating her hands in thick, brown sludge. She forced her way to the top and looked down the slope through the beam of her heavy flashlight. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The water was rushing down the hill, gathering speed, turning into a muddy torrent, just like it always did during a flash storm. But then it hit the first row of trenches. The water slammed into the first mud pond. It filled the 2-foot depression rapidly, boiling and churning. But the downhill berm, the mound of dirt she had carefully compacted, held it back. The water rose to the lip, completely perfectly level across the contour of the hill, and then gently spilled over the edge. It didn't rush. It trickled. The overflow slid down the slope and was instantly caught by the second staggered trench. Then the third. Clara walked down the hill in the freezing rain, her flashlight cutting through the deluge. The trenches were working. They were catching the violent runoff, breaking its momentum, forcing it to spread out horizontally. By the time the water reached the middle of her property, it wasn't a flood anymore. It was a series of calm, terraced pools. The 120 ugly, mocked mud ponds were completely full. Clara stood by the lowest pond, the rain still lashing against her face. She watched the surface of the water. It wasn't just sitting there. Bubbles were rising to the surface. Small, persistent streams of air escaping from the earth. The water was sinking. Because the ponds held the water in place, the baked clay had no choice but to absorb it. The hydrostatic pressure of the standing pools was forcing the moisture deep down into the subsoil, bypassing the hardened crust. She was injecting the water directly into the dead aquifer beneath her land. The storm raged for an hour before moving east, leaving a dripping, heavy silence in its wake. When dawn broke, the valley looked battered. Puddles choked the roadways, and the ditches along the highway were roaring with muddy runoff from the neighboring farms. Millions of gallons of water were already miles away, lost to the river system. Clara walked out onto her porch with a mug of black coffee. Her hillside didn't look like a war zone anymore. It looked like a terraced mirror. 120 pools of water reflected the grey morning sky. But already, the water levels in the top ponds were dropping, leaving behind dark, deeply saturated earth. She had caught the rain. Now, she just had to wait for the soil to wake up. September arrived, and the heat returned. The storm that had filled Clara's ponds became a distant memory for the rest of Oakhaven. For the neighboring farms, the water from that flash flood had vanished as quickly as it arrived, rushing over the hardpan and out into the county drainage ditches. The soil on Harlan Briggs's side of the fence turned back into a cracked, pale grey crust within 3 days. His massive centre pivot irrigators resumed their slow, groaning marches. The deep wells screamed as they sucked up muddy water, struggling to meet the demand of the sun-baked corn. But on Clara's hillside, the physics of the earth had fundamentally changed. The 120 ponds were empty on the surface, but the ground beneath them wasn't. The water hadn't evaporated. It had sunk. It had moved slowly through the compacted clay, following gravity, establishing a subterranean lens of moisture that stretched across the entire 60 acres. 2 weeks after the storm, Clara walked the upper ridge. She didn't carry a heavy laser level or a shovel this time. She carried a pocket knife. She knelt beside the edge of the third trench, drove the blade into the dirt, and twisted. The earth didn't shatter into dust. It yielded. It cleaved apart in dark, rich clumps. The soil was cool to the touch. Deep inside the clod, a single pale earthworm writhed, irritated by the sudden sunlight. Clara smiled. It was the first time she had smiled in 6 months. The seeds she had cast into the barren dust back in July, the deep-rooted winter rye and the crimson clover, were waking up. They had been sitting dormant, waiting for exactly this combination of moisture and warmth. Within days, a pale green fuzz began to paint the bottoms of the trenches. By the end of the month, that fuzz exploded into thick, emerald ribbons that traced the contour lines of the hill. The contrast was violently stark. If you drove down the county highway, you saw miles of dying, yellowing crops and grey dirt. Then you saw Clara's property. It looked like a giant fingerprint stamped into the valley, marked by vibrant looping rings of green vegetation. The roots of the rye punched deeper into the loosened soil, acting like microscopic hydraulic pumps, keeping the earth porous. When a lighter rain fell in October, there was zero runoff. The hillside absorbed every single drop like a sponge. In town, the jokes at Toby's diner abruptly stopped. Farmers are businessmen, but they are also acute observers of dirt. They couldn't ignore the math of what they were seeing. Clara's land was holding green pasture without a single irrigation pipe. Garrett, the excavator operator, was the first to actually stop by. He pulled his rusty truck into her driveway one afternoon, leaving the engine idling. He walked over to the fence, hooked his thumbs into his belt loops, and stared up the terraced slope. The clover was knee-high in the trenches, blooming with small red flowers. Clara walked down to meet him, wiping grease off her hands from fixing the tractor. "I drove past Harlan's place," Garrett said, his voice flat. He didn't look at her. He just kept staring at the green hillside. "He blew another pump motor last night, sucked up a boulder the size of a softball. The aquifer is collapsing down there." Clara leaned against the wooden fence post. "I heard. He's hauling water in by truck now just to keep the livestock alive," Garrett continued, finally turning to look at her. He took off his baseball cap and scratched his head. "I thought you were out of your damn mind, Clara. I told my wife I was stealing your money doing this job." "You did the job perfectly, Garrett." The angles held. Garrett looked back at the land. "How much water you reckon is in that hill?" "Enough," Clara said. "The water table under my property has risen 3 feet since August. I checked the monitoring pipe this morning. I'm going to run 50 head of cattle on this pasture next spring." Garrett chewed on his lower lip. He nodded slowly, a profound shift calculating in his eyes. "You still have that map?" "I do. I might have a few guys calling me, asking about my rates." He tipped his hat and walked back to his truck. The financial bleed on the commercial farms was turning fatal. Harlan Briggs was bleeding the fastest. By November, the drought officially entered its 2nd year. The bank refused to extend Harlan's credit line. He had poured $50,000 into well repairs and diesel fuel in a single season, chasing a receding water line that simply wasn't coming back. His corn yields were down 40%. His soybeans were stunted. The sheer brute force of industrial agriculture was hitting a concrete wall. You can't outspend nature when nature stops cooperating. Clara watched it happen from her porch. She didn't feel a sense of triumph. Watching a farm die is a terrible thing, no matter who owns it. It meant lost jobs for farm hands at the feed store, unpaid tabs at Toby's, and families quietly packing up U-Hauls in the middle of the night. If Harlan went under, a massive corporate conglomerate would buy his 2,000 acres for pennies on the dollar, consolidate it, and strip mine the rest of the topsoil. She needed her neighbors to survive. A single green hill in a desert is eventually just a target. Winter brought a bitter, dry cold that locked the valley in a deep freeze. The land went dormant, but the tension in Oak Haven did not. The drought hadn't just killed the crops, it was slowly suffocating the town's economy. Bright yellow auction flyers began appearing on the bulletin board at Toby's diner and stapled to telephone poles along the county highway. They read like obituaries for family legacies. In late January, exactly 6 months after Clara had torn up her pastures, a Black King Ranch pickup truck slowly crawled up her driveway. The suspension squeaked in the freezing air as it hit the deep, frozen ruts. Harlan Briggs stepped out. The man looked 10 years older than he had in July. The arrogant, broad-shouldered posture that usually carried him through the diner was entirely gone. His shoulders slumped beneath a heavy canvas chore coat, and the deep lines around his eyes were carved with profound exhaustion. He looked like a man who hadn't slept a full night since the summer. Clara stepped out onto the porch, pulling her thick wool cardigan tight against the biting wind. Harlan didn't walk up the wooden steps. He stood at the bottom, his boots crunching on the frozen gravel. He looked past her, out over her property. Even in the dead of winter, the ground was stable. The thick, dormant mats of winter rye held the topsoil firmly in place. While the wind ripped blinding clouds of grey dust off the neighbouring fields, there was no dust blowing off the Finch farm. "Bank called the loan," Harlan said. His voice was gravelly, stripped of all its usual booming volume. The wind caught his words and dragged them across the yard. Clara stayed quiet. She leaned against the porch rail and waited. "I got 30 days to restructure, or they start auctioning the equipment, the tractors, the combines." He kicked at a loose stone near the bottom step, keeping his eyes on the ground. "I spent 60 grand pumping water this year, Clara. 60 grand to grow corn that came up stunted and soy that barely covered the cost of the seed. I'm pumping mud now. The bottom of the aquifer is just gone." "I'm sorry, Harlan. I really am." He finally looked up at her. The pride was completely drained from his face, replaced by a hollow, desperate pragmatism. "My granddad cleared that land across the road, same time your granddad cleared this hill. We always believed if you just work harder, if you just buy a bigger rig and drill deeper, you can beat the dirt into giving you a living. You force it to yield. The dirt always wins eventually," Clara said softly, her breath pluming in the freezing air. "You just have to stop fighting it." Harlan let out a long, foggy breath. He looked back up the hill at the staggered, frozen swales that he had openly mocked just months prior. "Garrett says you have a map, a whole system." He was drinking at the tavern the other night, running his mouth. "He says you mapped the whole valley topography, not just your 60 acres, when you were figuring out your catchment angles." "I had to," Clara explained. "Water doesn't care about property lines or barbed wire. I needed to know how the runoff from your high fields fed into my watershed. I needed the math for the whole basin." Harlan took his hands out of his pockets. They were shaking slightly, whether from the bitter cold or the sheer stress of bankruptcy. She couldn't tell. "If I sell the center pivots, the scrap steel alone would pay off the immediate interest on the loan. It would get the bank off my neck for 6 months. I've already got a scrapper out of Omaha, willing to bring flatbeds down." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "But I wouldn't have a single way to water the spring crop. Unless—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The admission of defeat was too large to swallow whole. Asking the woman he had publicly ridiculed to save his family farm was a bitter pill. Clara didn't make him say it. She turned, walked back into the warmth of the house, and went straight to the kitchen table. She returned a minute later, carrying a large, tightly rolled sheet of drafting paper. She walked down the wooden steps, ignoring the cold, and handed it to him. Harlan unrolled it flat on the hood of his truck, pinning the corners down with his heavy forearms so the wind wouldn't take it. It was a highly detailed topographical map of his 2,000 acres, overlaid with a complex web of blue and red ink. It wasn't the rigid, geometric grid of industrial farming. It was organic. Sweeping, parallel curves matched the natural dips and rises of his fields, outlining exactly how water wanted to flow across his land. "It's a keyline design for your property," Clara said, leaning over the paper and pointing to a ridge elevation. "You don't need 120 deep ponds like I did. Your slope is much gentler, but the acreage is massive. You need a long, continuous subsoiler cuts. You hire tractors to rip the compacted hardpan 2 feet deep on a very slight downward angle." Harlan stared at the blue lines, his eyes tracing the paths. No pumps. No pumps, Clara confirmed, tapping the center of the map. Gravity does the heavy lifting. You start the cuts just off the main ridge. When the flash rains hit, the water falls into the rip lines. Instead of rushing downhill and washing your topsoil into the river, it stops. The channels force the water to spread sideways, dragging moisture out across the dry ridges. And the yield? Harlan asked, the businessman in him still twitching. The first year, your yields will drop. You're taking land out of active production to build the trenches, and the soil needs to heal. But your overhead drops by 80% immediately. No diesel for the water pumps, no well maintenance, no hauling water trucks. You stop bleeding cash on day one. He traced a sweeping contour line with a thick, calloused finger. A bitter smile touched the corner of his mouth. They laughed at you. They'll laugh at you too, Clara said, right up until their wells run dry and the bank takes their keys. Harlan rolled the map back up, slowly, carefully, as if it were a fragile artifact. He held it tightly against his chest, tucking it inside his coat like a shield against the wind. He looked at Clara, his eyes damp and red-rimmed. Why did you draw this up for me? After what I said to you in July? I stood right at your fence and called you a fool, because if your farm turns into a dust bowl, the wind blows that dust straight onto my clover, Clara said, her tone deadpan, but lacking any real malice. And because my dad liked your dad. We share the same water table, Harlan. If you drain it dry, my farm dies too. If we both fill it, we survive. It's just math. Harlan nodded slowly. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. The white-knuckled grip on the map said enough. He got back in his truck, put it in gear, and drove away. 3 days later, the Oakhaven Valley witnessed a spectacle that left Toby's diner buzzing for a week. A convoy of massive flatbed trucks from Omaha rolled down the county highway, loading up pieces of Harlan Briggs's multi-million-dollar center-pivot irrigation systems. He was selling them for scrap. The metal vultures were picking the bones of the old way of farming. But 2 weeks after that, a different sound returned to the valley. It wasn't the desperate, high-pitched whine of failing deep-well pumps. It was the heavy, rhythmic, diesel-throated grinding of earth movers. Harlan hadn't just paid off the bank. He had hired Garrett and every other heavy equipment contractor in a 50-mile radius. They weren't drilling for fossil water. They were digging for the future. They tore massive, sweeping scars across the 2,000 acres, following the precise blue lines on Clara's drafting paper. It was a monumental undertaking, carving geometry into the dirt from dawn until dusk. By March, the desperation in the town had shifted into a frantic curiosity. 2 other struggling farmers, the Hayes brothers down the road, knocked on Clara's door, asking if she had any more drafting paper. Clara spent her evenings at the kitchen table beneath a warm yellow bulb, drawing contour lines, calculating drop angles, and designing water catchments for the very neighbors who had mocked her frog ponds 6 months prior. When the spring rains finally arrived in late April, they came down hard. The sky broke open in a torrential downpour that would normally spell disaster. But this time, the valley didn't flood. The muddy torrents that usually choked the county ditches and washed away the fertilizer were simply gone. Instead, the water spread out. It hit Harlan's massive, sweeping trenches. It slowed down. It turned sideways, creeping across the ridges, and then it sank silently into the earth. Clara stood on her porch, wrapped in a blanket, holding a mug of coffee. She listened to the steady drumming of the rain on the tin roof and looked across the road at Harlan's farm. The ground was heavily scarred and muddy, looking like a World War I battlefield. But Clara knew exactly what was happening underneath the mud. The compacted soil was finally drinking. The dead aquifer was breathing. The earth was waking up, and this time, the whole valley was ready to catch it. Sometimes the craziest ideas are the only ones that actually work. Clara stood against the whole town, ignoring the mockery because she knew the old way of farming was a dead end. But catching the rain is only half the battle. What happens when the ground wakes up and her neighbors realize they're pumping sand while she's sitting on an oasis? Drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next story of rural revenge and redemption.